Part 1. Hey guys, tonight we wander down a narrow medieval street where the morning mist still clings to crooked timber houses, where yesterday's rain has turned the road into something that politely pretends to be a street but behaves much more like an ambitious mud puddle. The market stalls are only beginning to unfold. A baker is pulling warm loaves from an oven somewhere nearby, and just ahead of you sits a tiny tailor's workshop with a wooden sign gently creaking in the breeze. It doesn't look particularly impressive. In fact, compared to a modern clothing store, you'd probably mistake it for someone's unusually cluttered garage. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a week here without complaining about the complete lack of coffee machines, air conditioning, or online shopping. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me your local time and where you're listening from down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slow your pace as the little workshop comes into view, its front door already standing open to invite in every bit of precious morning light. Candles are expensive, oil is precious, sunshine, thankfully, remains gloriously free, even in the Middle Ages. Inside, the room feels smaller than you expected, much smaller. If you stretched out both arms, you might nearly touch opposite walls. Every available surface has been claimed by something useful. Rolls of wool lean against rough wooden beams. Bundles of linen rest inside woven baskets. Spools of thread sit carefully organized in small carved boxes that have clearly survived several owners. The air carries a fascinating mixture of smells. Fresh wool, beeswax, wood shavings, a faint trace of smoke drifting in from the neighboring blacksmith. And somewhere underneath it all, the unmistakable scent of people who've been working very hard without the invention of deodorant. You decide not to breathe quite so deeply. The tailor himself has already been awake for hours. Like many craftsmen throughout medieval Europe, he rises before sunrise whenever possible. A workshop survives only if work begins early, especially during busy seasons before festivals or weddings. This wasn't unusual at all. In many medieval towns, craftsmen organized their days around available daylight rather than clocks, because reliable personal timepieces simply didn't exist for ordinary people. Instead of checking a smartwatch, he checks the sun, much cheaper. Battery life is excellent. His apprentice arrives moments later, carrying an armful of folded fabric almost larger than himself. The boy can't be older than 14, though apprentices sometimes began even younger depending on local customs and family arrangements. His first task is not sewing, far from it. Before anyone touches a needle, the shop itself must wake up. Benches are swept, loose threads gathered, tools returned to their places. Water fetched from the public well. The floor receives a quick brushing, not because cleanliness is a medieval obsession, but because losing a tiny iron needle in yesterday's straw could become tomorrow's disaster. You quickly discover that medieval tailoring involves far more cleaning than dramatic stitching. Not exactly what fashion magazines promised. A common historical fact often surprises modern visitors. Many medieval workshops served simultaneously as workplace, storefront, classroom, and family home. The tailor's wife may manage accounts, prepare meals, or even assist with sewing. Children might help wind thread or sort scraps. Grandparents, if fortunate enough to still be living, often contribute simple tasks while quietly observing everything. Business and family exist under one roof. Privacy is, let's politely call it, limited. As sunlight creeps farther across the floorboards, customers begin appearing. Not crowds, just individuals. A farmer needing worn sleeves repaired. A merchant requesting a better traveling cloak. A young man nervously asking about wedding clothes while pretending not to be nervous at all. You notice something interesting. Almost nobody comes expecting brand new wardrobes every season. Clothing represents wealth. Even a single wool tunic may require weeks of labor before anyone ever wears it. Fabric itself often costs more than the tailor's actual sewing time. People treasure clothes because replacing them is expensive. Very expensive. Modern closets filled with 30 nearly identical t-shirts would seem utterly baffling. Historians generally agree that clothing was among the most valuable possessions ordinary medieval families owned, sometimes appearing in wills alongside livestock, furniture, and household tools. Now that's one serious laundry basket. Your eyes wander toward the tailor's workbench. Unlike modern sewing tables covered in electric machines, everything here depends entirely on human hands. Iron shears, needles, awls, thread, wax, simple chalk-like marking materials. Nothing buzzes, nothing hums, nothing plugs into a wall because, well, electricity remains several centuries away from making anyone's either easier or considerably more complicated. The apprentice carefully rubs thread across a block of beeswax. You wonder why. Soon you learn the answer. Wax strengthens the fibers, reduces tangling, and helps the thread glide through tightly woven cloth with less fraying. It's a tiny detail, almost invisible, yet it saves countless frustrating moments during long hours of sewing. Little tricks like this rarely appear in grand history books, but they quietly kept civilizations clothed. One lesser-known fact fascinates many historians. Some medieval tailors guarded their preferred stitching methods almost like family recipes. Certain finishing techniques produce stronger seams or neater appearances, giving one workshop a better reputation than another. Written instruction manuals were uncommon. So much of the knowledge traveled directly from master to apprentice through years of observation. Secrets weren't locked inside computers, they were locked inside experienced hands. Outside, church bells ring across the town, not simply announcing time. They organize life itself, opening markets, calling worshipers, warning of emergencies, marking funerals, celebrating feast days. Your tailor barely pauses, his hands continue sorting cloth with calm precision. Routine becomes its own kind of meditation. You begin noticing the rhythm. Fabric unfolds, scissors scrape, needles tap softly against wood, footsteps pass outside, someone laughs in the street. A cartwheel complains loudly about every stone beneath it. Even the pigeons seem surprisingly committed to their daily conversations. The workshop isn't quiet, it's peaceful in a practical way. Historians are still debating whether the average medieval tailor specialized heavily in particular garments or remained broadly skilled enough to create nearly everything customers required. The answer likely varied between bustling cities and tiny villages, where versatility often mattered more than specialization. For now, your own place inside this tiny workshop feels unexpectedly comfortable. You've only been here a short while, yet already the outside world seems to fade. The morning sun grows warmer. The wooden beams glow softly. The apprentice quietly hums something without words while organizing folded linen. The tailor lifts his heavy shears. A fresh length of wool is carefully unrolled across the table. Another day has officially begun, and before the first cut is made, before the first stitch disappears into cloth, you find yourself realizing that every garment you'll watch come to life over the coming hours begins not with extraordinary talent, but with patient preparation, practiced hands, and the quiet confidence earned one ordinary morning after another. Part 2. The first length of wool now rests across the broad wooden table, its surface worn smooth by decades of careful work. The tailor runs both palms over the cloth, not because he expects it to change, but because his fingers can detect tiny imperfections long before his eyes would notice them. You lean a little closer, realizing that in this little shop, touch is every bit as important as sight. The fabric feels surprisingly alive. Not alive in the dramatic storybook sense, of course. More like a stubborn house cat that decides whether it wishes to cooperate. You watch the apprentice carefully unroll another bolt beside it. This one is lighter in color, woven from linen rather than wool. Even without modern labels, barcodes, or cheerful sales tags announcing 100% natural fibers, everyone in the workshop knows exactly what each piece is. Experience has become the label. Long before sewing begins, cloth itself tells a story. Most medieval Europeans wore wool almost every day. Sheep could survive the climate across much of Europe, and wool provided warmth, durability, and remarkable versatility. Rich or poor, nearly everyone owned something made from it. Linen, spun from flax, served a different purpose. It was lighter, cooler, and especially useful for undergarments that rested directly against the skin. Cotton, by comparison, remained uncommon across much of medieval Europe. Silk? That belonged to an entirely different world. If someone casually walked into this little shop asking for silk pajamas, the tailor might first assume they were joking. then wonder whether they had recently inherited a castle. You notice the master picking up one corner of the wool and holding it toward the doorway where sunlight pours inside. Tiny fibers catch the light in different ways, revealing subtle inconsistencies that disappear indoors. He gently bends the cloth back and forth, listening almost as much as watching. That surprises you. Fabric makes sounds. A tightly woven cloth gives a firm, reassuring rustle. Looser weaving produces a softer whisper. Tiny flaws sometimes announce themselves with unexpected stiffness. Modern shoppers might read product reviews online. Your medieval tailor simply listens to the wool. Battery not required. The apprentice reaches for another bundle, stacked neatly against the wall. This one contains fabric purchased only a few days earlier from the town market. Medieval markets were essential centers of textile trade, connecting villages, monasteries, merchants, and distant regions through an astonishing network of commerce. English wool became famous across Europe. Flemish weavers earned remarkable reputations for fine cloth. Italian merchants imported luxurious fabrics from even farther east. The little workshop may seem isolated, yet invisible trade routes stretch far beyond these narrow streets. You begin imagining sheep grazing on distant hillsides months before this very cloth appeared here. Farmers sheared the fleece, workers washed it in streams. Women and men spent endless hours carding, spinning, and weaving. Merchants transported finished boats over muddy roads, rivers, and occasionally dangerous mountain passes. Only then does the tailor finally receive enough cloth to make a single tunic. One simple garment carries the labor of hundreds of unseen hands. That thought makes every folded piece seem strangely precious. An unusual historical detail often escapes attention. Freshly woven wool frequently retained traces of lanolin, the natural oil found in sheep's fleece. Depending on how thoroughly the cloth had been cleaned, some fabrics still carried a faint earthy scent that reminded experienced craftsmen exactly where the material had begun its journey. In other words, your new clothes occasionally smell just a little bit like their original owner. The sheep, thankfully, had already moved on. The tailor picks up another bolt made from much finer wool. Immediately you notice the difference. It drapes more smoothly over the table, like almost flowing like water compared with the heavier cloth beside it. This piece is destined for a prosperous merchant. Good customers deserve good fabric. Customers who actually pay on time deserve even better fabric. The apprentice quietly nods as though he understands this universal truth. Payment has always had remarkable motivational powers. You notice there are no giant storage rooms packed floor to ceiling with inventory. Every bolt of cloth represents money tied up inside the workshop. Too much stock creates risk. Too little means disappointing customers. Managing inventory remains surprisingly familiar, even 8 centuries later. Only the spreadsheets are missing. Instead, everything lives inside the tailor's memory. You begin appreciating just how extraordinary that memory must be. He remembers who supplied each bolt, which customer requested which color, how much remains from earlier orders, which scraps might become children's sleeves or useful patches. Nothing is wasted if it can possibly be saved. That habit will become even more important later in your journey. Outside, another customer arrives carrying his own fabric rather than buying it through the tailor. This was entirely normal. Many customers supplied cloth themselves, asking only for the tailor's skill in transforming it into wearable garments. The arrangement benefits everyone. The customer controls the material. The tailor provides expertise, rather like bringing ingredients to an exceptionally patient chef, except mistakes cannot be hidden beneath extra seasoning. The tailor carefully unfolds the customer's cloth without saying much. Respect matters here. Insulting someone's expensive fabric would be poor business. Instead, he examines every inch, checking weave, checking thickness, checking consistency. A slight nod finally appears. Acceptable. Only then does the conversation move toward measurements and design. You begin noticing how differently people viewed clothing compared with today. Fashion certainly existed and styles changed over time, but durability almost always outranked novelty. A garment might be expected to last for years, perhaps even decades if repaired carefully. Children inherited clothes. Servants inherited clothes. Relatives inherited clothes. Sometimes garments outlived several owners. Fast fashion would seem almost magical. or deeply suspicious? Probably both. One fascinating fact rarely discussed involves cloth width. Medieval looms often produced relatively narrow pieces of fabric compared with many modern textiles. Tailors had to plan carefully, arranging pattern pieces to maximize every available inch while avoiding unnecessary waste. Every cut mattered. Every mistake became expensive. You can almost feel the tension before the scissors ever touched the cloth. Historians are still debating whether regional preferences for wool quality influenced clothing styles more than social status itself, since available local materials often shaped fashion just as strongly as wealth. In some places, practicality quietly overruled elegance. The apprentice begins folding away the remaining bolts after each inspection. He handles every piece gently, almost respectfully. You understand why. These are not simply supplies. They are weeks of wages, months of labor, entire flocks transformed into possibility. Sunlight shifts slowly across the floor as dust motes drift lazily through the air. Somewhere outside, a horse snorts impatiently. The baker's bread smells even richer now, mixing with wool, beeswax, and freshly cut wood until the little workshop feels comfortably familiar. The tailor rests one hand upon the chosen length of cloth. Not cutting yet, just thinking, planning, measuring the future before a single thread is disturbed. Because once steel meets wool, there is no stitching the fabric back into the bolt from which it came. And in a world where every inch carries real value, patience is every bit as important as skill. Part 3. The chosen bolt of cloth still lies perfectly flat across the workbench, untouched by the heavy shears resting nearby. The tailor has spent several quiet minutes simply looking at it, calculating measurements in his mind before committing to a single cut. You begin to realize that, in this tiny workshop, the most valuable tool is not the scissors. It is patience. Now the customer steps forward. He stands as naturally as he can, although naturally quickly disappears once another human begins inspecting every part of your body with professional concentration. You suddenly understand that being measured in the Middle Ages feels slightly awkward. Some traditions truly never change. The tailor reaches for what appears to be a narrow strip of woven linen, not a printed measuring tape, not one marked neatly in centimeters or inches, simply a flexible cord that has been used so many times its edges have become wonderfully soft. He wraps it around the customer's chest, then around the waist, across the shoulders, down one arm. The apprentice quietly watches every movement without speaking. This is education, not from books, not from lectures, but from repetition. A medieval apprenticeship relied almost entirely upon observation. Young apprentices spent years watching before they were trusted with increasingly important responsibilities. Reading manuals could never replace thousands of hours spent beside an experienced master. The tailor pauses for only a moment. Then, instead of writing every number into a notebook, he remembers them. You blink. Surely no one remembers all of that. Yet he does. Many medieval craftsmen developed astonishing memories because written records remained limited and paper itself was valuable. Wax tablets, scraps of parchment, or simple tally marks certainly existed, but experienced artisans often relied heavily on mental calculation. Apparently, the original cloud storage was someone's brain. Storage capacity, surprisingly impressive. Backup system, less reliable after a sleepless night. The apprentice finally receives permission to record a few details onto a small wax tablet using a pointed stylus. The marks look temporary because they are. Later, the surface can simply be smoothed flat and used again. Nothing goes to waste, not even note-taking. The customer raises one arm while the tailor quietly checks sleeve length. Then he bends slightly forward as shoulder width is estimated with practiced eyes rather than rigid formulas. You notice something fascinating. The tailor rarely measures twice. Instead, he compares. Shoulders relative to chest, waist relative to hips, arm length compared with height. His experience allows him to see proportions instead of isolated numbers. Modern software might generate a three-dimensional body scan in seconds. Here, one careful glance accomplishes surprisingly much. The customer shifts his weight. The tailor notices immediately. Stand comfortably. Simple advice. Very important advice. A poorly balanced stance creates inaccurate measurements, leading to uncomfortable clothing later. Medieval garments needed freedom of movement for walking, riding horses, working fields, climbing stairs, and occasionally escaping particularly angry livestock. No one wants trousers that surrender halfway through chasing a goose. That would become memorable for entirely the wrong reasons. As measurements continue, another customer enters. She carries folded linen beneath one arm and patiently waits near the doorway. Nobody seems impatient. Work takes time. Everyone understands that. This slower rhythm feels almost unfamiliar to you. There are no appointment reminders vibrating inside pockets, no digital queue numbers, no customer satisfaction surveys asking whether today's measuring experience exceeded expectations. Just people, waiting, talking quietly, living at the pace available to them. A well-established historical fact is that clothing often reflected not only wealth but occupation. Merchants, craftsmen, clergy, scholars, and laborers all tended to wear garments suited to their daily work. Even subtle differences in sleeve shape, cloak length, or fabric quality could quietly communicate someone's place within society. Clothes spoke before people did, sometimes much louder. The tailor now asks the customer to stretch both arms. Not dramatically, just enough. He wants to understand movement. A garment fitting perfectly while standing still may become uncomfortable the moment someone begins lifting, bending, or reaching. Centuries before ergonomic design became fashionable, someone was already thinking about elbows. You smile quietly. Human joints have always been wonderfully inconvenient. The apprentice carefully lays another strip of cloth beside the customer, using it as a visual reference rather than an exact ruler. There were no universally standardized measurement systems across medieval Europe. Different towns often used slightly different local units, and craftsmen adapted accordingly. Personal experience frequently mattered more than mathematical precision. Consistency came from practice, not bureaucracy. One particularly curious fact surprises many historians. Some experienced tailors became so familiar with regular customers that they barely needed fresh measurements at all. They remembered body shapes, posture, even slight habits like one shoulder sitting lower than the other. Imagine walking into your neighborhood shop and someone remembering the exact length of your sleeves from 5 years ago. Comforting, slightly mysterious, possibly alarming. The customer quietly discusses details: a wider neckline, slightly longer sleeves, enough room beneath the arms for comfortable riding. Nothing extravagant. Every adjustment means more planning. The tailor nods without interrupting. Listening carefully may save hours of unnecessary work later. Good communication has always been cheaper than fixing mistakes. Outside, church bells ring once again. Shadows shift across the doorway. Morning gradually gives way toward midday. The workshop grows warmer. You notice tiny beads of perspiration forming beneath the apprentice's hairline as he continues moving folded cloth from one shelf to another. No one complains. Summer arrives whether anyone approves or not. Your attention returns to the customer. The measuring cord has now traveled around nearly every part of his body, yet somehow the process never feels rushed. There is a quiet dignity to it. Neither party speaks more than necessary. Professional trust fills the silence. You begin wondering how many thousands of people this tailor has measured over the years. Hundreds? Perhaps more. Each one different. Each one expecting clothing that feels almost effortless once completed. That expectation never changes. Only the centuries do. The apprentice finally rolls the measuring cord neatly into a loose coil before placing it beside the wax tablet. Everything returns to its proper place. Order matters. Disorder wastes time. Time costs money. Some lessons travel through history without changing a single stitch. Historians are still debating whether the greatest medieval tailors relied more heavily on precise measuring or on visual judgment developed through decades of experience. Surviving garments suggest that remarkable craftsmanship often came from blending both methods rather than choosing only one. The customer thanks the tailor with a respectful nod before stepping outside into the busy street. No garment exists yet. No cloth has been cut. No needle has pierced fabric, and yet the most important stage has already happened. Because before wool becomes sleeves, before linen becomes collars, before thread quietly disappears into perfect seams, someone first had to understand the person who would one day wear it. Only then could the tailor finally reach for the heavy iron shears waiting patiently upon the bench, ready for the moment when careful thought would give way to an irreversible first cut. Part 4. The customer has gone. The measurements have been quietly committed to memory, and the workshop settles into one of those peaceful silences that only busy places seem capable of creating. Outside, carts continue rumbling over uneven stones, merchants call out the day's prices, and somewhere nearby a rooster confidently announces the morning for what feels like the fifth time. Perhaps no one ever informed him the morning had already started. You stand beside the workbench as the tailor reaches for the heavy iron shears. They are nothing like the lightweight scissors tucked into modern kitchen drawers. These are solid, dense, cold to the touch. Years of sharpening have given their blades a gentle curve that feels almost like an extension of the craftsman's hands. He lifts them with practiced ease. You briefly wonder if they qualify as exercise equipment. A few weeks in this workshop, and your forearms would probably become remarkably impressive. The tailor smooths the wool one final time. His palms glide slowly across the cloth, pressing out tiny ripples before the cutting begins. Even a slight wrinkle could distort the shape of a sleeve or collar. There is no rushing this moment. Unlike sewing, cutting allows no second attempt. Once the blades close, the cloth remembers forever. A widely accepted historical fact is that medieval tailors rarely worked from paper patterns in the way many modern dressmakers do. While simple templates certainly existed in some places, especially later in the Middle Ages, experienced craftsmen often relied on proportional knowledge, chalk markings, and years of repetition. Their pattern lived mostly inside their minds. That sounds wonderfully romantic. Until you realize forgetting one measurement could become an extremely expensive afternoon. The apprentice hands over a small piece of white chalk, though depending on the region it might actually be soft limestone, charcoal, or another marking material. The tailor sketches a series of gentle lines directly onto the fabric. Nothing elaborate, just enough. A shoulder here, a sleeve there. The outline of a body beginning to emerge from a plain rectangle of wool. You notice something curious. The markings seem surprisingly economical. Very little empty space remains between each future garment piece. Every corner has a purpose. Every curve considers the next cut. Fabric costs too much to waste. The layout reminds you of someone carefully packing a suitcase before a long journey, fitting everything together with almost magical efficiency. Except this puzzle cannot be rearranged after the scissors begin. The first cut arrives. Not dramatically, no triumphant music, no theatrical flourish, just the slow, steady sound of iron blades sliding through tightly woven wool. Snip, pause, adjust, snip again. The rhythm is strangely soothing, almost hypnotic. You begin understanding why experienced apprentices spent hours simply watching. There is far more happening than appears at first glance. The tailor never forces the scissors. Instead, he allows the weight of the blades to help guide each movement. His left hand supports the fabric while his right controls the cut. The cloth stays flat. The line remains true. Precision grows from patience rather than speed. Modern electric rotary cutters would certainly finish faster, but they would miss this quiet conversation between steel and cloth. A lesser-known historical detail involves the scissors themselves. High-quality iron shears represented a significant investment for a small workshop. Good blades lasted many years when properly maintained, and craftsmen sharpened them regularly using whetstones. Poorly sharpened scissors could crush fibers instead of slicing cleanly, leaving rough edges that complicated every stage afterward. In other words, a dull blade created tomorrow's problems today. Rather like trying to slice fresh bread with a spoon. Technically possible, emotionally exhausting. The apprentice carefully gathers each finished piece as soon as it is cut. Nothing touches the dusty floor. Nothing becomes mixed together. He stacks sleeves separately from front panels, collars beside cuffs, smaller pieces arranged neatly according to size. His movements look almost ceremonial. You suspect they are. Lose one small strip of fabric now, and hours of careful planning begin unraveling. The workshop contains surprisingly few spare materials. There is no mysterious warehouse waiting to rescue mistakes. Every missing piece matters. The tailor reaches the curved section beneath the arm. Here his movements become slower still. These gentle curves determine comfort more than appearance. Too narrow, and the customer struggles to move. Too loose, and the garment hangs awkwardly. Centuries before anyone spoke about ergonomic design, someone had already discovered the importance of comfortable armpits. History truly contains unexpected heroes. Outside, another merchant passes carrying brightly dyed cloth across one shoulder. For just a moment, sunlight catches the rich blue fabric. The apprentice watches with admiration. Blue remains expensive, especially certain brilliant shades. Color itself often reflects wealth. Back inside, the tailor sets the shears aside for a moment. Not because he is tired, because he is thinking. He quietly rearranges several smaller pattern pieces before making the next cuts. Then you understand. He intends to save the largest possible scraps. Not all leftover cloth becomes waste. Far from it. Remaining pieces might become children's garments, pockets, bindings, repairs, hats, or decorative trims. Even tiny fragments sometimes found new purpose as stuffing, patches, cleaning cloths, or reinforcement hidden inside collars. Nothing respectable gets thrown away simply because it is small. The medieval world practiced recycling long before anyone invented the word. You begin looking differently at the growing pile of offcuts. Not rubbish, future opportunities. One fascinating fact surprises many people. Some medieval garments included gussets, small diamond or triangular-shaped inserts placed beneath arms or between legs. These modest additions dramatically improved freedom of movement while allowing tailors to use narrow cloth more efficiently. Tiny pieces, enormous difference. Sometimes the smallest shapes carried the greatest responsibility. The apprentice carefully marked several pieces using small notches rather than written labels. These tiny cuts help identify which edges belong together later during sewing. Simple, reliable, impossible to smudge away. Modern factories might print barcodes. This workshop trusts tiny triangles, remarkably effective. The tailor lifts one sleeve piece toward the doorway, checking it against the light just as he inspected the uncut wool earlier. No flaws, no hidden weak spots. Satisfied, he places it atop the growing stack. His face changes very little throughout the morning. No exaggerated smiles, no visible frustration, just calm concentration. You realize something. Skill often looks quiet. The greatest craftsmen rarely appear hurried because they have already solved most problems inside their minds before their hands begin working. Outside, the town grows louder. Children chase one another through the street. A dog barks enthusiastically at absolutely nothing. Someone drops a wooden bucket. Life continues. Inside the workshop, however, every sound remains measured. Steel closes, cloth whispers, wood creaks gently beneath shifting weight. The apprentice hums the same simple tune you heard earlier. Perhaps he does not even realize he is doing it anymore. Historians are still debating whether medieval tailors generally cut garments individually for each customer or relied upon a small number of familiar proportional layouts that they adjusted according to experience. Surviving evidence suggests both approaches existed, varying between regions, workshops, and generations of craftsmen. The final piece is separated from the remaining bolt. The shears close one last time. Silence settles for a heartbeat. Before you lies not a finished garment, but something equally remarkable. Possibility. Where moments ago there had been one continuous length of wool, there are now sleeves, panels, gussets, and collars waiting patiently for the next stage of their transformation. The hardest decision of the morning has already been made. No cut can be undone. No cloth can return to the bolt from which it came. Now, with every piece resting neatly in its place, the tailor reaches toward a small block of beeswax and a bundle of carefully wound thread. The quiet work of stitching is about to begin. Part 5. The heavy shears have finally been set aside. Their work is finished for now. Across the wooden bench, the carefully cut pieces of wool lie in neat little stacks, each one waiting patiently for its turn. They hardly resemble clothing yet. To an unfamiliar eye, they might look like oddly shaped scraps arranged by someone with an unusually strong appreciation for geometry. Only the tailor can already see the finished garment. You still see a puzzle. He sees a coat. The apprentice clears away the loose fibers left behind by cutting. Tiny strands cling to the table, catching the sunlight that pours through the open doorway. He sweeps them into a small basket without a second thought. Even the floor seems relieved. One less thing trying to become tomorrow's splinter. The tailor reaches for the small bundle of linen thread resting beside a block of golden beeswax. You watched him prepare thread earlier. Now you finally understand why. Before threading the needle, he slowly draws the thread across the wax once more. Again and again. Each pass leaves only the thinnest invisible coating. The wax stiffens the fibers just enough to prevent tangles while helping the thread slide more smoothly through tightly woven cloth. Such a tiny habit, such an enormous difference after several thousand stitches. Modern sewing machines hide most of this work from us. Here, every improvement comes from someone's hands. The needle itself looks surprisingly small. Forged from iron rather than polished modern steel, it lacks the perfect uniformity you might expect today. Even so, it has been carefully crafted with an eye just large enough for the wax thread. Needles were valuable possessions. Losing one was genuinely irritating, especially because somewhere beneath the straw-covered floor, it would continue existing purely out of spite. The apprentice threads the needle with practiced fingers. No squinting, no muttering, no dramatic declarations that the whole keeps moving. You suspect he's already threaded several hundred this month alone. A well-established historical fact is that hand sewing remained the foundation of clothing production throughout the Middle Ages. Every seam, every hem, every cuff, and every collar depended entirely upon patient human labor. The sewing machine would not appear for many centuries. Speed simply wasn't part of the equation. Steadiness was. The tailor begins with one of the larger body panels. Instead of immediately making tiny decorative stitches, he starts with longer temporary ones that loosely hold pieces together. You recognize the wisdom almost instantly. Why permanently join fabric before confirming everything lines up correctly? Even in the 13th century, nobody enjoys unpicking stitches. The apprentice holds one edge carefully while the tailor guides the needle through both layers. Push, pull, tighten, repeat. The rhythm becomes mesmerizing. There is no wasted movement. Every stitch mirrors the last with quiet consistency, not identical. Human hands never achieve mathematical perfection, but close enough that your eyes begin accepting the pattern as naturally ordered. The room itself seems to slow down. Outside, life remains noisy. Inside, time begins measuring itself in stitches rather than minutes. You notice how often the tailor pauses, not because he's uncertain, because he is constantly checking alignment. A sleeve opening shifted by only a finger's width now could become a frustrating problem hours later. Patience prevents apology. The apprentice occasionally hands over another prepared needle. Keeping several threaded in advance saves valuable time. Little efficiencies like this quietly accumulate throughout the day. No single shortcut transforms the workshop. Hundreds of tiny habits do. One fascinating detail often overlooked involves posture. Many medieval tailors worked seated on simple wooden benches near windows whenever possible. Natural daylight offered the clearest view of thread and cloth, reducing eye strain during the endless hours of close work. Artificial light existed. It simply wasn't nearly as cooperative. Candles flickered, oil lamps smoked. Sunlight remained the workshop's favorite employee. It never requested wages. You glance toward the doorway. The angle of the sunlight has already shifted noticeably. Morning is slipping quietly toward afternoon. Without clocks, the movement of light itself becomes part of everyone's schedule. The tailor scarcely notices. His hands have developed their own sense of time. A curious historical fact surprises many people. Different seams served different purposes. Some were designed primarily for strength, especially in areas experiencing constant strain like shoulders or underarms. Others emphasized neat appearance, particularly on garments belonging to wealthier customers. Beauty mattered. Durability mattered more. After all, nobody wants their sleeve negotiating independence halfway through carrying firewood. The apprentice smiles faintly as he trims an extra thread. Perhaps he imagined the same unfortunate scenario. The first temporary seam is complete. The tailor lifts the joined pieces, allowing them to hang naturally. Gravity performs its own inspection. The cloth settles smoothly. No twisting, no puckering. A satisfied nod follows. No applause, just quiet approval. That seems to be enough. You begin appreciating how little conversation fills the workshop. Words appear only when necessary. Most communication happens through glances, small gestures, shared routines developed over years. The apprentice already knows when another needle will be needed before the tailor asks. The tailor already knows when the apprentice has spotted a problem. Their silence isn't emptiness, it's experience. Nearby rests a basket overflowing with tiny scraps left from earlier projects, nothing larger than your hand, yet none of them are discarded. Some will reinforce collars, others become patches. The smallest pieces may wrap delicate tools or strengthen hidden seams. Waste is treated almost like an insult. If cloth still possesses usefulness, someone will eventually discover it. Outside, a woman carrying freshly washed linen passes the workshop. Bright white fabric flutters gently in the breeze. For just a moment, sunlight reflects into the room, illuminating every drifting dust particle. The entire workshop seems suspended inside a golden haze. You almost forget the century. Then someone outside loudly argues with a donkey. History has a charming way of restoring perspective. The tailor now replaces the temporary stitches with stronger permanent ones. These are smaller, closer together. Each pull of the thread feels deliberate, firm enough to secure the seam without puckering the cloth. Your eyes naturally begin following the needle. In, out, pull, repeat, thousands of times. You finally understand why skilled hands matter so much. Anyone can push a needle through fabric. Doing so consistently for 10 hours without growing careless, that is another matter entirely. One little-known historical detail concerns thread itself. Linen thread remained especially popular because of its remarkable strength. Silk thread existed for luxurious garments, while wool thread found certain uses, but well-spun linen offered dependable durability for everyday clothing. Simple materials, exceptional reliability. The apprentice quietly rewaxes another length of thread. His movements have become almost automatic. Perhaps one day, years from now, another apprentice will watch him with the same careful attention. Knowledge travels here, one stitch at a time, not through lectures, not through examinations, through repetition. Historians are still debating whether medieval apprentices spent more time mastering individual stitches or learning the broader judgment required to choose the right stitch for each situation. Surviving garments suggest that technical skill alone never made a great tailor. Wisdom in applying it mattered just as much. The afternoon light grows warmer. A gentle breeze slips through the doorway, carrying the comforting scent of fresh bread from the nearby bakery. The tailor barely glances outside. One seam has just been completed. Another waits beside it, then another. The garment is beginning, almost imperceptibly, to resemble clothing instead of carefully arranged pieces of cloth. Not through speed, not through miracles, but through thousands of patient movements, each so small that none seem important on their own. Yet together, they quietly transform flat wool into something another person will wear for years, perhaps even decades, long after today's peaceful afternoon has faded into memory. Now part 6. The first strong seams now hold the garment together. Not completely, not beautifully, but securely enough that you can finally recognize its shape without relying entirely on imagination. What began this morning as a single bolt of wool has slowly become something with shoulders, sleeves, and the unmistakable outline of a coat waiting to be finished. The transformation feels almost magical, except every bit of magic has involved sore fingers. The tailor lifts the half-finished garment from the bench and gives it a gentle shake. The wool settles naturally. A fold here, a wrinkle there. Nothing unexpected. He studies the drape in complete silence. You begin noticing something remarkable. He doesn't stare at the garment itself for very long. Instead, his eyes constantly move. Shoulder, collar, hem, sleeve, back again. He's comparing every section against the picture already living inside his mind. A great tailor, you realize, spends nearly as much time looking as sewing. The apprentice waits patiently nearby, holding a small wooden box filled with needles of different sizes. Some are slightly longer, others finer. A few have clearly been repaired after years of careful use. Nothing is discarded simply because it has aged. You quietly admire that philosophy. It applies surprisingly well to people, too. The master reaches for a finer needle. Now the real craftsmanship begins. Large structural seams are important, of course, but they are not what customers admire. Customers notice collars that sit properly, cuffs that lie flat, necklines that feel comfortable, edges that refuse to fray after months of wear. Those details build reputations. The apprentice carefully folds the sleeve inward. The tailor begins making tiny, nearly invisible stitches along the inside edge. You lean closer. The stitches are astonishingly even. Not because he measures each one, because his hands no longer need to think about them. Years of repetition have transformed deliberate practice into instinct. Modern musicians might call it muscle memory. The medieval tailor simply calls it Tuesday. A widely accepted historical fact is that medieval craftsmen often judged one another by the quality of their finishing work rather than by the speed of production. Hidden seams, neatly turned hems, and durable reinforcement reflected genuine skill that experienced customers quickly recognized. Good work advertised itself. No colorful billboards required. The apprentice hands over a small awl. At first glance, it resembles a simple pointed spike. Its purpose, however, is wonderfully practical. When the cloth becomes especially thick, forcing a needle through multiple layers risks bending or breaking it. Instead, the awl gently opens a path first. Only then does the needle follow. It's a surprisingly elegant solution. You briefly imagine trying to push modern denim together with nothing but determination. Suddenly, the awl seems like one of humanity's finest inventions, perhaps second only to warm blankets. The tailor pauses again, not because of the stitching, because he has spotted something almost invisible. One edge of the collar sits ever so slightly uneven. You would never have noticed. The apprentice doesn't notice either. The master quietly removes 6 perfectly good stitches, then 7, then another 4. No sigh, no frustration, simply calm acceptance. Fixing mistakes early costs less than ignoring them. That lesson seems timeless. The apprentice watches carefully. This is perhaps the most valuable lesson of the day. Not how to avoid every mistake, but how to respond when one appears. You realize that mastery is often defined less by perfection than by patience. One fascinating historical detail involves apprentices themselves. Many young boys entered apprenticeship contracts lasting anywhere from 5 to 7 years, sometimes even longer depending on the trade and the region. During that time, they learned not only technical skills, but also business practices, customer etiquette, bookkeeping, and workshop discipline. In other words, they weren't simply learning to sew. They were learning how to become trusted members of their community. The workshop itself becomes the classroom. Every customer becomes part of the lesson. Outside, 2 children run laughing through the street, chasing what appears to be an extremely determined goose. The goose, judging by its confidence, believes it is winning. Honestly, it probably is. The brief commotion fades quickly. Inside, calm returns almost immediately. The tailor now reaches for a narrow strip of linen. This will strengthen the inside of the collar where constant movement slowly wears away the fabric. No customer will ever see it. That hardly matters. Hidden strength is still strength, perhaps especially so. You begin appreciating how much of good craftsmanship remains invisible. The finest stitches disappear beneath folded cloth. The strongest reinforcements hide inside seams. The greatest compliments often come years later, when a garment still functions long after others have worn out. There is something deeply satisfying about work intended to last. Another little-known fact surprises many historians. Some medieval tailors reused thread whenever possible during adjustments. If a seam had to be opened carefully, portions of the thread could sometimes serve again, particularly during fitting stages before final completion. Waste offended both the wallet and the conscience. Resources had traveled too far to be treated carelessly. The apprentice now practices on a scrap piece beside the master. His stitches wander ever so slightly. One sits too long, another pulls too tightly. The fabric puckers. He immediately notices. Without a word, he removes them and starts again. The master doesn't intervene. Not yet. Learning requires room for small failures, provided they happen on scraps instead of expensive customer orders. You quietly smile. The workshop possesses an unspoken rule. Better to ruin practice cloth today than ruin someone's wedding tunic next month. Sunlight continues creeping across the wooden floor. The warm golden beam that reached only halfway through the doorway this morning now stretches almost to the back wall. Dust floats lazily through the light like tiny drifting stars. Somewhere nearby, the baker removes another batch of bread from the oven. The familiar aroma slips through the open window once more. You suddenly realize you've been here for hours, yet the day has never felt rushed. The pace of hand sewing quietly reshapes your own breathing. Even your thoughts seem slower now, calmer. The tailor gently presses one completed seam between thumb and forefinger, feeling, testing, listening almost. Satisfied, he places the garment back onto the table. Not finished. Closer. Every careful decision has brought it one step nearer completion. Historians are still debating whether the finest medieval workshops achieved their remarkable consistency primarily through strict apprenticeship systems or through the individual genius of exceptional master craftsmen. Most surviving evidence suggests that lasting excellence came from both talented teachers patiently shaping equally dedicated students over many years. The apprentice rewinds another length of linen thread around his fingers. The master reaches once more for the wax. The collar is complete, the cuffs await, then the hem, then countless finishing touches almost no one will consciously notice. And perhaps that is the greatest compliment a tailor can receive. When someone wears a well-made garment, they stop thinking about the clothing altogether. It simply fits. It moves. It serves. Quietly, faithfully, season after season. Just like the humble little workshop, where every secret worth knowing is passed from one steady pair of hands to the next, one careful stitch at a time. Part 7. By now, the coat has begun to resemble something a customer could genuinely wear. The sleeves hang naturally from the shoulders, the collar sits neatly against the neckline, and the strongest seams have already disappeared beneath careful finishing stitches. It still lacks a few important details, but its personality has finally begun to emerge. You almost expect it to introduce itself. Thankfully, it remains quite modest. The tailor lays the garment across the workbench one more time before carefully brushing away a few loose fibers. Every tiny strand seems determined to cling to the wool. Static electricity hasn't been invented yet. Stubborn sheep apparently have. The apprentice steps outside and looks briefly up the street. He's watching for today's customer. Not because appointments are scheduled to the minute, but because experienced craftsmen generally know when regular patrons are likely to arrive. Life follows familiar rhythms in a medieval town. Church bells, market hours, meals, sunlight. People gradually become part of that rhythm themselves. Sure enough, only a few moments later, the customer appears. He greets the tailor with a respectful nod before stepping into the workshop. There are no fitting rooms, no full-length mirrors stretching from floor to ceiling, no cheerful sales assistants asking whether you'd like to try another size. Just one modest room, one wooden bench, and several experienced eyes. A well-established historical fact is that garments were often tried on several times during construction. Even the most skilled tailor preferred making small adjustments throughout the process, rather than discovering major problems after every seam had already been completed. A little patience now. Saved many unhappy conversations later. The customer removes his old outer garment and carefully slips his arms into the unfinished coat. The wool settles over his shoulders. For several long seconds, nobody speaks. The tailor simply watches. Not the fabric, the man. How he stands, how he breathes, whether one shoulder naturally sits lower than the other, whether the sleeves twist slightly when his arms move. You realize something fascinating. The garment is being judged in motion, not at rest. The tailor quietly asks the customer to lift one arm, then the other. Now stretch both forward. Now pretend to reach for something high above your head. The customer obediently follows every instruction. You briefly imagine modern clothing stores asking shoppers to imitate climbing a ladder before purchasing a jacket. It would certainly make the fitting rooms more entertaining. The apprentice circles slowly around the customer, noting tiny folds, watching where the cloth pulls, looking for wrinkles that reveal hidden tension beneath the surface. A wrinkle, you discover, is often a message. The cloth is quietly telling the tailor where something needs attention. The master gently pinches the fabric near one shoulder, just a little too much fullness. He marks the spot with a tiny pin. Next comes the waist. The garment fits comfortably, but perhaps, just perhaps, a little too comfortably. One careful adjustment could improve the silhouette without sacrificing movement. The customer nods in agreement. No one seems offended. Good clothing is a collaboration, not a contest. One fascinating historical detail is that medieval pins themselves were valuable enough to deserve careful handling. Before mass production, Small metal objects required considerable skill to manufacture, and workshops treated them with far more respect than we might today. Lose a pin now, and someone will eventually find it barefoot, usually at exactly the wrong moment. The apprentice smiles politely as he gathers a handful of pins from a small wooden cushion. Each one has clearly been counted many times before. Nothing leaves the workshop carelessly. The tailor kneels briefly to inspect the hem. It hangs almost perfectly. Almost. The front sits a finger's width lower than the back. You would never have noticed. He notices immediately. With 2 quick folds and several temporary stitches, the imbalance disappears. The coat suddenly looks calmer somehow. Balanced. You hadn't realized clothing could appear relaxed. Apparently, it can. Outside, merchants continue calling customers toward their stalls. A cart loaded with firewood creaks slowly past. Children laugh somewhere farther down the street. Life flows steadily around the little workshop without interrupting its peaceful concentration. Inside, time seems to move differently, measured not in hours, but in improvements. The tailor now asks the customer to sit. Another interesting test. Some garments fit beautifully while standing but become uncomfortable the moment someone bends at the waist. The customer lowers himself onto the wooden bench. The coat settles naturally. No pulling, no bunching, no dramatic surrender by the seams. Success. You can almost feel the tailor relaxing. Almost. Professional satisfaction remains wonderfully understated. Another lesser-known fact often surprises historians. Many medieval garments intentionally included a little extra room to allow for layering during colder seasons. Since central heating remained several centuries away, people frequently wore multiple layers beneath heavier outer clothing. Fashion had to cooperate with winter. Winter rarely negotiated. The customer stands once more. The tailor gently smooths the collar, then quietly removes several temporary stitches. His fingers move with astonishing confidence. He knows exactly where every thread begins and ends. Watching him work feels almost like watching someone untangle a spider's web without disturbing a single strand. The apprentice observes every movement carefully. One day, this responsibility will belong to him. Not yet, but eventually. The master finally speaks a little more than usual. Just a few practical questions. Does the sleeve feel comfortable? Can you raise your arms easily? Is the collar too tight when turning your head? The customer answers honestly. A slight adjustment beneath the left arm. Everything else feels excellent. The tailor nods once. No defensive explanations, no insistence that the customer is mistaken. Simply another problem waiting to be solved. Good craftsmen rarely argue with evidence. One curious historical fact involves reputation. In medieval towns, word of mouth could determine whether a tailor prospered or struggled. A satisfied customer might recommend the workshop to friends, neighbors, merchants, even local officials. A poorly fitted garment could damage trust far beyond a single sale. Every customer quietly became an advertisement or a warning. Business cards were unnecessary. Satisfied neighbors worked just fine. The customer carefully removes the unfinished coat and hands it back. It already looks significantly better than when he first arrived. Not because dramatic changes occurred, because dozens of tiny corrections quietly accumulated. The apprentice immediately begins removing the temporary pins while the tailor studies each marked adjustment one final time. Nothing has been left to chance. Every note reflects something observed directly. The afternoon sunlight grows softer now, casting long golden beams across the wooden floorboards. Dust drifts lazily through the warm light, settling gently upon unused rolls of cloth stacked against the wall. The bakery's delicious aroma has been replaced by the comforting scent of evening cooking fires beginning throughout the town. The day is slowly changing. So is the garment. Historians are still debating whether medieval customers generally expected several fittings or accepted fewer adjustments depending on local customs, wealth, and the complexity of the garment itself. Evidence suggests that expensive commissions often receive considerably more attention than everyday clothing, though even simple garments benefited from careful fitting whenever possible. The workshop grows quiet again after the customer leaves. No applause marks the successful fitting. No ribbon-cutting ceremony celebrates a properly balanced sleeve. Just the familiar sounds returning. Thread being drawn through cloth, the soft scrape of a needle, the creak of the old workbench, the apprentice preparing fresh wax, the master picking up the coat once more. Its final form is now within reach. Only the finishing touches remain. And as you watch those steady hands return to their patient work, you begin to understand that the finest garments are not created by rushing toward completion, but by giving every tiny imperfection the kindness of one more careful look before calling the work truly finished. Part 8. The customer has gone home for the evening, leaving the unfinished coat resting quietly across the workbench. The fitting has answered almost every important question. The sleeves sit comfortably. The shoulders move freely. The collar no longer pulls awkwardly when the wearer turns his head. Only the finishing remains, which, as you are beginning to suspect, somehow takes nearly as long as everything that came before it. The apprentice lights a small oil lamp, though its flame serves more as insurance than necessity. The last warm rays of afternoon sunlight still spill generously through the workshop door, painting long golden stripes across the wooden floor. The tailor prefers natural light whenever possible. Your eyes certainly agree. The lamp makes everything look dramatically mysterious. The sun simply helps you avoid sewing your sleeve to the table. The master picks up a small bundle wrapped carefully in linen. Inside are narrow strips of colored cloth. Deep blue, muted green, soft reddish brown, a tiny piece of brilliant crimson. Nothing here seems especially flashy by modern standards, yet compared with the ordinary shades surrounding them, these colors almost glow. You ask yourself why such little scraps are stored so carefully. The answer arrives almost immediately. Decoration. Not excessive decoration, just enough. During much of the Middle Ages, clothing often reflected both practical needs and social identity. Wealthier customers could afford richer dyes, finer fabrics, decorative trims, embroidery, or contrasting linings. Ordinary craftsmen usually dressed more simply, though even modest garments sometimes included tasteful details that reflected local traditions. Fashion certainly existed. It simply moved at the speed of horses instead of hashtags. The apprentice unfolds the narrow crimson strip. The tailor considers it thoughtfully, then quietly shakes his head. Too bold. Instead, he reaches for a darker blue edging that will strengthen the cuffs while adding a subtle touch of elegance. Good taste, apparently, has always involved knowing when to stop. One fascinating historical fact is that certain colors were astonishingly expensive because the dyes themselves came from rare plants, insects, or imported materials. Brilliant reds, rich purples, and vivid blues often required enormous labor to produce, making them symbols of prosperity long before anyone invented designer labels. A colorful sleeve could quietly announce considerable wealth without saying a single word. The apprentice begins carefully folding the blue trim around the edge of one cuff. The strip is surprisingly narrow, barely wider than your smallest finger. Yet attaching it neatly requires remarkable concentration. The tailor stitches slowly. Tiny, invisible stitches disappear beneath the folded edge. From the outside, almost nothing can be seen. Exactly as intended. You begin appreciating something unexpected. The finest craftsmanship often hides itself. Anyone can notice large decorations. Only experienced eyes admire what remains invisible. Outside, a merchant walks past carrying baskets of freshly dyed yarn. Even from the doorway, you notice subtle differences in color. Some blues lean toward gray. Others shimmer slightly green. A warm reddish wool catches the lowering sunlight beautifully. Color, you realize, is never just color. It carries stories of distant trade, of skilled dyers, of costly ingredients, of patient hands. Another little-known historical detail involves dyes themselves. Many natural colors gradually softened after repeated washing and years of sunlight. Medieval people fully expected garments to age gracefully rather than remain permanently identical to the day they were made. Clothing matured alongside its owner, rather like a favorite leather chair, or perhaps a particularly loyal dog. Both become more charming with time. The tailor now reaches toward another customer order waiting nearby. This one belongs to a prosperous merchant's wife. The cloth is noticeably finer. The stitches become even smaller. You almost have difficulty seeing them. Luxury often reveals itself through restraint rather than extravagance. The apprentice whispers a quiet question. The master answers by demonstrating rather than explaining. He sews 3 perfect stitches, removes one, repeats the motion. The lesson requires no lecture. Watching remains the language of apprenticeship. You remember the young apprentice from earlier this morning, carefully observing every movement. Hours later, he still watches with exactly the same concentration. Knowledge here travels slowly, like water smoothing stone, one careful repetition after another. Outside, church bells begin announcing evening prayers. Several passersby briefly pause before continuing their journeys. The streets gradually grow calmer. Market voices soften. Cart wheels become less frequent. Even the pigeons appear slightly less opinionated than they were this morning. Perhaps they are simply tired. The tailor certainly isn't. He now opens a small wooden box lined with scraps of linen. Inside rests several precious buttons. Not dozens, only a handful. Buttons existed during parts of the later Middle Ages, though many garments still relied upon ties, brooches, lacing, or simple fastening methods depending on region, style, and historical period. Decorative buttons often became more common as tailoring techniques continued evolving. Each button is examined individually, not because they differ dramatically, because consistency matters. No customer wants one button quietly pursuing its own artistic vision. The apprentice carefully threads another fine needle. The master begins attaching the first fastening. Every stitch anchors the button securely from beneath. He gently tests its strength with a slow pull. Satisfied, then the next, and the next. Nothing hurried, nothing careless. One fascinating fact that surprises many historians concerns medieval sumptuary laws. In various kingdoms and cities, authorities occasionally passed laws restricting who could wear certain fabrics, furs, jewelry, or colors. These regulations attempted to preserve visible social distinctions, although enforcing them proved considerably more complicated than writing them. Apparently, people have always enjoyed dressing slightly above expectations. Some traditions truly never disappear. The apprentice smiles as he sorts tiny leftover scraps into separate baskets. Good wool, fine linen, useful bindings, very small fragments. Everything receives its proper place. Nothing simply becomes rubbish. You recall the offcuts from earlier in the day. At the time, they looked insignificant. Now you realize they represent tomorrow's repairs, next month's patches, perhaps next year's children's clothing. The workshop wastes almost nothing. Modern recycling campaigns would likely approve enthusiastically, though perhaps with slightly fewer geese wandering through the streets. The evening air drifting inside has grown cooler. Someone nearby has begun roasting onions over an open fire. The comforting aroma mixes with beeswax, wool, fresh wood, and lamp oil until the workshop possesses its own unmistakable scent. You suspect that years from now, one breath of beeswax and wool would instantly bring this entire day back into memory. Smell is wonderfully loyal that way. The tailor lifts the nearly finished coat one final time before placing it carefully upon a wooden hanger carved by a local carpenter years ago. It hangs beautifully, balanced, quiet, ready. Almost. Historians are still debating whether fashion trends spread primarily through merchants, noble courts, traveling craftsmen, or ordinary townspeople adapting ideas they observed in neighboring regions. The evidence suggests that style traveled along many roads at once, carried by trade, conversation, migration, and simple human curiosity. The last golden light slips below the rooftops outside. Shadows gently fill the corners of the workshop. The apprentice closes the shutters halfway. The master tidies his tools with the same care he used while sewing. Every needle returns to its place. Every thread is wound neatly. The shears rest once more upon the workbench. Tomorrow they will begin another transformation. But tonight, the little tailor's shop grows quieter with every passing moment, as another day's patient labor settles softly into the fabric of history, one careful stitch, one thoughtful choice, and one humble garment at a time. Part 9. Morning arrives once again without ceremony. No alarm clock rings. No phone vibrates insistently from a bedside table. Instead, the first sounds drift gently through the open shutters of the workshop. The distant crow of a rooster convinced that he personally controls the sunrise. The steady clatter of wooden cart wheels rolling over uneven cobblestones. And the familiar church bells welcoming another working day. The tailor is already awake. Of course he is. Cloth waits for no one. Neither do customers. The apprentice sweeps yesterday's few remaining threads from beneath the workbench, while the master carefully unlocks a sturdy wooden chest tucked against the back wall. Inside are folded account records, several neatly tied bundles of coins, a few precious contracts, and something that surprises you, a small wooden seal. Plain, simple, but important. Today, you discover that being a medieval tailor involves far more than cutting cloth and sewing seams. It also means belonging to something much larger, the Guild, or, as many people called it, the Fellowship of Craftsmen. A well-established historical fact is that many medieval towns across Europe organized skilled trades into guilds. Tailors, blacksmiths, bakers, shoemakers, carpenters, and countless others often belonged to these associations, which helped regulate quality, training, prices, and professional standards. Think of it as a professional organization, only with fewer PowerPoint presentations and considerably more wool. The tailor places the wooden seal into a small cloth pouch before preparing to leave the workshop. The apprentice naturally follows. You do too. Outside, the town feels fully awake now. Market stalls overflow with vegetables, cheeses, candles, ropes, and fabrics. Housewives negotiate prices with astonishing confidence. Merchants loudly advertise imported goods from distant cities. Children weave effortlessly between adults carrying baskets nearly as large as themselves. Somehow, no one collides. You would almost certainly collide, probably twice. The guild hall stands only a short walk away. It isn't a grand palace, nor is it an ordinary house. Its sturdy timber frame and carved doorway quietly announce that important business happens here. Inside, several fellow tailors have already gathered, some older, some younger, a few accompanied by apprentices who stand respectfully behind their masters. Conversation remains polite but practical. No one wastes words unnecessarily. One tailor discusses the rising cost of fine Flemish wool. Another mentions a merchant delayed by muddy roads after heavy rain. A third quietly complains about an apprentice who somehow misplaced 3 perfectly good needles. The apprentice beside you immediately looks down at his shoes. Probably a wise decision. Guild meetings, you realize, are wonderfully human. One fascinating historical detail often overlooked is that guilds serve not only economic purposes, but also social ones. Members frequently supported one another during illness, funerals, religious festivals, and family emergencies. In many towns, belonging to a guild meant belonging to an extended professional community. Business and friendship often shared the same table. The master greets several colleagues warmly. No elaborate bows, just familiar respect earned through years of shared work. You notice that nobody boasts loudly about being the greatest tailor in town. Reputation seems to speak more quietly here, and perhaps more convincingly. A senior guild member carefully examines a newly completed garment brought by one of the younger masters, not searching for perfection, searching for consistency, the stitching, the seams, the finishing. Everything receives patient attention. Approval matters. Poor workmanship affects everyone. If one tailor develops a reputation for careless work, customers may begin doubting the entire trade. Quality protects not only individuals, it protects the profession itself. The inspection concludes with a satisfied nod. No applause follows. Medieval craftsmen appear wonderfully economical with celebrations. The apprentice whispers that one day, after enough years of training and proving his skill, he hopes to become a master himself. You look at him differently now. Yesterday, he seemed simply a helpful assistant. Today, you recognize someone quietly building an entire future. Another well-known historical fact is that apprentices generally progress through several stages before achieving full independence. After years of learning, many became journeymen, traveling to work under different masters and expanding their experience before eventually qualifying to open workshops of their own. Education did not end with apprenticeship. It continued through life. Rather refreshing, really. The meeting gradually turns toward practical matters: prices, material shortages, upcoming religious festivals likely to increase customer demand. One merchant warns that shipments of fine cloth from abroad may arrive late because heavy rains have damaged several bridges. Even centuries ago, supply chains had an impressive talent for creating headaches. Some traditions truly are immortal. A fascinating lesser-known fact concerns counterfeit workmanship. Occasionally, dishonest individuals attempted to sell poorly made garments while falsely claiming guild-quality craftsmanship. Guild officials sometimes investigated complaints to protect both customers and legitimate artisans. Apparently, fake designer products have remarkably ancient ancestors. Outside, the marketplace grows busier still. You hear livestock, bells, laughter, arguments over cabbage prices that somehow sound deeply important. History often reminds you that ordinary life rarely pauses for dramatic events. Most people simply keep working. Back inside the guild hall, discussion shifts toward apprentices. One elderly master smiles gently while recalling his own training decades earlier. Another laughs about accidentally sewing one sleeve completely inside out during his second year. The room fills with quiet amusement. Even masters were once beginners, comforting thought. The apprentice beside you smiles too. Perhaps his future mistakes suddenly feel less frightening. The meeting concludes with a short prayer for honest work, fair dealing, and prosperous trade. Nothing extravagant, simply gratitude. Then everyone quietly returns to their own workshops. The streets seem even livelier now. Fresh bread emerges from ovens. Blacksmiths strike glowing iron. Potters display newly fired bowls. Weavers stretch damp cloth beneath the sun. Every trade supports another. Every craft depends upon countless unseen neighbors. The tailor cannot work without weavers. The weaver depends upon shepherds. The shepherd relies upon blacksmiths for tools. The blacksmith purchases bread from bakers. The baker wears clothing stitched by tailors. The entire town resembles an enormous piece of fabric itself, each thread strengthening another. You find the thought unexpectedly beautiful. Back inside the familiar little workshop, everything waits exactly where it was left. The shears, the needles, the beeswax, the folded wool, home. The apprentice immediately resumes sorting thread while the master reviews today's customer list from memory. There will be repairs, measurements, new commissions, perhaps one urgent request before an approaching wedding. The rhythm begins again, steady, comforting, reliable. Historians are still debating whether guild regulations consistently improve craftsmanship or occasionally slowed innovation by protecting established methods too carefully. The truth was likely a mixture of both, as guilds preserved remarkable standards while sometimes resisting unfamiliar techniques that challenged tradition. The tailor picks up another length of cloth. The apprentice prepares fresh linen thread. Outside, the bells ring once more. A new day quietly unfolds. And you realize that while kings may shape kingdoms and generals may win battles, countless ordinary craftsmen like this humble tailor patiently stitch together the everyday fabric of medieval life. One customer, one garment, and one honest day's work after another. Part 10. The guild meeting is already beginning to fade into memory as the familiar rhythm of the workshop quietly takes over once again. The shears rest on the bench. The needles wait in their little wooden box. Freshly waxed thread lies coiled like tiny sleeping snakes that, thankfully, have absolutely no intention of biting anyone. Probably. A soft knock sounds against the open door. The tailor looks up with the calm expression you've come to recognize over the past few days. Another customer. This time, however, the difference is immediately obvious. His clothing speaks before he does. The man standing in the doorway wears a finely woven wool cloak fastened with an elegant brooch. His leather boots are clean despite the muddy streets outside, and the embroidered cuffs of his tunic suggest that he spends considerably more time reading account books than carrying sacks of grain. A prosperous merchant. Not nobility, but certainly comfortable. He removes his gloves with deliberate care and greets the tailor warmly. It seems these two know each other well. Trust, you realize, is excellent for business. The merchant carefully unwraps a folded length of exceptionally fine cloth from inside a protective linen covering. Even before touching it, you can see the difference. The weave is tighter, the surface smoother, the color richer. This cloth has traveled a very long way. A well-established historical fact is that wealthy merchants often purchased imported fabrics through extensive trade networks stretching across Europe and beyond. Italian city-states, Flemish weaving centers, and long-distance merchants connected distant regions, allowing luxury textiles to appear even in relatively modest medieval towns. The little workshop suddenly feels connected to half the continent. The tailor gently lifts the fabric between his fingers. He smiles. Only slightly. Professional craftsmen rarely become overly dramatic. Still, you can tell he approves. The apprentice stands a little straighter too. Fine cloth deserves careful attention. Actually, Everything deserves careful attention, but expensive mistakes receive especially memorable reactions. The merchant quietly explains his request: a new outer coat, warm enough for winter travel, elegant enough for business meetings, comfortable enough to wear while riding long distances. Practicality and prestige must somehow become the same garment. Quite an ambitious shopping list. The tailor nods thoughtfully. He has heard requests like this before, probably many times. You notice how differently this conversation unfolds compared with earlier customers. The merchant discusses subtle details: the width of the collar, the depth of the sleeves, the placement of decorative stitching. Nothing flashy, everything intentional. For prosperous clients, clothing communicates success almost as clearly as spoken words. Another fascinating historical detail is that successful merchants often invested heavily in appearance because respectable clothing inspired confidence among trading partners. A well-made coat could quietly suggest reliability, stability, and financial success before negotiations even began. Clothing functioned almost like a business card, only significantly warmer during winter. Measurements begin once again. The familiar linen cord circles chest, shoulders, waist, and arms. The apprentice records notes upon the reusable wax tablet. The process feels comfortably familiar now. You recognize nearly every movement, yet each customer introduces tiny differences. This merchant carries himself with unusually straight posture. Perhaps years of formal meetings, perhaps confidence, perhaps simply good luck with his spine. Whatever the reason, the tailor notices immediately. The apprentice notices too. Learning continues. Outside, another figure approaches the workshop: an elderly farmer. His arrival could hardly be more different. His tunic shows careful repairs at both elbows. The knees of his trousers have clearly survived countless seasons in muddy fields. His boots have been patched so many times that original leather and later repairs have become almost impossible to distinguish. He waits patiently near the doorway. The tailor politely finishes speaking with the merchant before inviting the farmer inside. The contrast is striking. One customer brings expensive imported cloth. The other carries an old wool coat folded carefully beneath one arm. Not for replacement, for repair. A widely accepted historical fact is that most ordinary medieval people repaired clothing repeatedly rather than replacing it. Fabric represented enormous value, and even badly worn garments often remained worth mending again and again. A tear rarely meant the end. It simply meant another afternoon's work. The farmer unfolds the old coat. The elbows have worn thin. One sleeve has separated along a seam. Several patches from earlier years remain firmly attached. The garment tells the story of a hard-working life. The tailor examines every inch respectfully. No judgment. No disappointment. Repair work matters just as much as creating something new. Perhaps even more, because repairs preserve memories already woven into the cloth. The apprentice carefully places the merchant's luxurious fabric safely aside before helping spread the farmer's coat across the bench. Two completely different customers, one identical respect. You find that quietly reassuring. Another lesser-known historical fact is that skilled medieval tailors often specialized in alterations and repairs for loyal customers. Maintaining garments could provide reliable income alongside larger commissions, particularly during seasons when fewer people ordered entirely new clothing. Nothing in the workshop remains idle for long. Even old clothes continue earning attention. The tailor studies the damaged elbow. He gently rubs the surrounding fabric between thumb and forefinger. Still strong. Good. Only the worn section requires reinforcement. No need to replace what continues serving faithfully. You smile. The philosophy extends beyond tailoring again. The farmer chuckles softly while explaining how the tear happened. Apparently, one particularly stubborn fence post disagreed with his sleeve. The fence post won, at least temporarily. The apprentice grins. Some battles simply aren't worth arguing about, especially against wooden posts. The merchant, still waiting nearby, listens with genuine interest. For a few moments, wealth quietly disappears. Two men simply discuss clothing, weather, travel, the coming harvest. The workshop becomes less a shop and more a meeting place. You remember how earlier generations described many medieval craft shops as both workplaces and community spaces. Now you understand why. People arrive with garments. They often leave with conversations as well. Outside, afternoon sunlight begins warming the doorway. The familiar scent of baking bread drifts inside once more. You have started expecting it around this time each day. Some rhythms become surprisingly comforting. The tailor estimates the repair aloud. Only a modest charge. The farmer nods gratefully. Good work does not always require expensive cloth. Sometimes it requires honesty. The merchant's new commission will certainly earn more silver. Yet the tailor treats both tasks with equal concentration. His reputation depends upon every stitch, not only the expensive ones. One particularly curious historical fact involves inheritance. Well-made garments belonging to prosperous families sometimes appeared in wills, passed carefully from one generation to another, alongside furniture, livestock, and household tools. Quality clothing represented genuine wealth that could outlive its original owner. A coat, it seems, could become part of family history. Historians are still debating whether differences between wealthy and ordinary clothing were more strongly influenced by fabric quality or by the complexity of tailoring itself. Surviving garments suggest that both played important roles, with luxurious materials often paired with increasingly sophisticated construction techniques. The merchant carefully gathers his precious cloth before leaving it safely in the tailor's care. The farmer leaves his beloved old coat folded neatly upon the bench. One commission begins, another continues. The apprentice prepares fresh linen thread. The master reaches for his favorite needle. And as another peaceful afternoon settles over the little workshop, you realize that every garment, whether destined for a prosperous merchant or a hardworking farmer, receives the same quiet gift of patience, one careful stitch at a time. Part 11. The merchant's fine cloth now rests safely inside the workshop, waiting for its transformation into an elegant traveling coat. Beside it lies the farmer's old garment, faded by years of rain, sunlight, and honest labor. They could hardly be more different, yet on the tailor's bench, they occupy equal space. The apprentice begins the morning by carefully examining the farmer's worn sleeve under the brightest patch of sunlight near the doorway. He turns the cloth slowly, back and forth, looking not only at the obvious tear, but also at the surrounding fibers. The master watches quietly. A repair should solve tomorrow's problems as well as today's. Simply stitching the hole closed would accomplish very little if the neighboring cloth was already beginning to weaken. The apprentice gently rubs the fabric between his fingers. Still strong enough. Good. The master nods almost imperceptibly. Approval given. No speech required. A well-established historical fact is that medieval tailors frequently reinforced worn areas instead of replacing entire garments. Elbows, knees, cuffs, and collars received particular attention because these sections endured constant movement and friction throughout everyday life. People expected clothes to age. Tailors simply helped them age gracefully. The apprentice searches through a carefully organized basket of wool scraps collected over many months. Different colors, different weights, different weaves. Nothing has been thrown away. You remember the tiny offcuts saved from earlier chapters of your journey. Now they finally reveal their purpose. The apprentice finds a patch almost identical in color. Not perfect, but close enough that only someone looking very carefully would notice. Considering medieval mirrors were rather modest by modern standards, the sleeve probably sleeps quite peacefully. The tailor trims the patch into an oval. Sharp corners tend to catch and peel over time. Rounded edges survive longer. Such a simple decision, such practical wisdom. You quietly admire how experience often hides inside details so small that most people never notice them. The patch is carefully placed beneath the damaged area rather than on top. The master begins stitching with firm, evenly spaced movements. Each stitch passes through strong cloth before crossing the worn section. Strength supports weakness, never the other way around. There is something unexpectedly comforting about that. Outside, the marketplace hums with familiar life. A cooper hammers iron hoops onto wooden barrels. Nearby, someone loudly advertises fresh apples. Two dogs engage in an extremely serious discussion about absolutely nothing. Neither appears willing to compromise. History, it seems, has always included barking. The farmer returns briefly to ask whether the repair will be ready before the weekend. The tailor smiles gently, almost certainly. The farmer thanks him warmly. No contracts, no digital invoices, just mutual trust built over many years. One fascinating historical detail often overlooked is that medieval customers frequently developed lifelong relationships with local craftsmen. Families returned generation after generation to the same tailor, blacksmith, baker, or carpenter because reputation mattered enormously in smaller communities. The workshop becomes part of family history, as familiar as church bells or the village well. The repair continues steadily. When the patch is fully secured, the tailor gently turns the sleeve inside out. Now you understand why. The interior must look nearly as tidy as the exterior. Good craftsmanship refuses to hide behind the lining. The apprentice carefully trims the last loose thread. The sleeve appears almost new, not new enough to erase its past, just strong enough to continue its future. You suspect the farmer will be pleased, very pleased. The master now turns his attention toward the merchant's commission waiting patiently nearby. He unfolds the expensive cloth once more. Even after spending days surrounded by wool and linen, you still notice the remarkable quality immediately. Some fabrics simply possess quiet confidence. The apprentice washes his hands carefully before touching it. An unnecessary gesture? Perhaps. A respectful one? Certainly. The tailor begins planning decorative stitching for the collar. Nothing extravagant, just subtle lines that will catch light without demanding attention. Luxury whispers. It rarely needs to shout. Another fascinating historical fact is that decorative stitching sometimes served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Additional rows of stitching strengthened edges while simultaneously creating elegant patterns that reflected regional styles or the tailor's personal craftsmanship. Beauty and usefulness shared the same thread. Quite literally, the apprentice prepares several colors of thread for comparison: soft brown, dark blue, natural linen. The master places each against the cloth in turn. Blue, no, brown, almost. Natural linen, perfect. The simplest choice often proves the wisest. You smile. Apparently even medieval fashion appreciated restraint. Outside, church bells announce midday. Several nearby workshops pause briefly for a simple meal. Inside the tailor's shop, lunch appears modest but satisfying. Dark bread, a wedge of cheese, a few onions, fresh ale diluted with water. No elaborate feast. Just enough to continue the day's work. The apprentice eagerly tears his bread. The master quietly shares an extra piece without saying a word. Small kindnesses rarely announce themselves. They simply happen. You realize that over the past several days, you've learned almost as much about people as about tailoring. Patience, respect, steady work, quiet generosity. These qualities seem stitched into the workshop as firmly as any seam. Another little-known historical detail surprises many historians. Many craftsmen observed religious feast days throughout the year, meaning work naturally followed a seasonal rhythm. Busy periods before major celebrations often filled workshops with urgent commissions, while quieter weeks allowed time for repairs, tool maintenance, and training apprentices. Work breathed with the calendar, rather than racing against it. The afternoon brings another visitor, not a customer this time. Another tailor. He stops by briefly to borrow a specialized awl before returning it tomorrow. The master agrees immediately. Professional competition exists, but so does cooperation. After all, craftsmen may compete for customers. They also depend upon one another during difficult times. The visiting tailor admires the repaired sleeve. He runs one finger gently across the nearly invisible patch. A smile, no words. Approval from another master carries its own quiet weight. The apprentice watches this exchange carefully. Reputation is earned one garment at a time, not proclaimed. The afternoon sunlight softens once again. Long shadows stretch across the wooden floor. Dust floats lazily through the warm air. The familiar scent of beeswax mingles with wool and freshly cut timber drifting in from a carpenter's shop nearby. Everything feels comfortably familiar now, as though you have lived inside this workshop far longer than a few peaceful days. Historians are still debating whether the average medieval tailor spent more time creating entirely new garments or maintaining existing wardrobes through alterations and repairs. Surviving records suggest that repair work formed a surprisingly large part of everyday business, reminding us that medieval people valued longevity far more than constant replacement. The repaired coat is folded neatly, ready for the farmer. The merchant's elegant commission waits beside it. its first careful stitches already beginning to appear beneath the master's steady hands. Old cloth, new cloth, both receiving exactly the same quiet attention. And as evening slowly settles over the town once again, you begin to understand that perhaps the greatest skill of all is not simply knowing how to sew, but knowing how to help something well loved continue serving for just a little while longer. Part 12. The repaired farmer's coat now rests neatly folded on the corner of the workbench, waiting for its owner to collect it. Nearby, the merchant's elegant new coat continues to take shape, its fine wool catching the morning light that pours through the open doorway. Old and new, past and future, both sharing the same bench. The apprentice gently brushes away a few loose threads before opening a wooden chest tucked beneath the table. Inside, you expect to find discarded scraps. Instead, you discover treasure. Not gold, not silver, fabric. Hundreds of carefully sorted pieces of it. Some are no larger than your palm. Others are long, narrow strips rolled into tidy bundles. Nothing has been tossed carelessly inside. Every scrap has its own place. You suddenly remember the offcuts collected days earlier when the first garment was being cut. The tailor had saved every useful piece. Now you finally understand why. A well-established historical fact is that cloth represented one of the most valuable household materials in medieval Europe. Because producing fabric required enormous amounts of labor, from raising sheep or flax to spinning, weaving, dyeing, and transporting, people rarely discarded textiles while any useful life remained. Waste simply wasn't practical, nor was it affordable. The apprentice begins sorting today's newest scraps into separate baskets. Fine wool, heavy wool, linen, binding strips, pieces suitable for children's clothing, tiny fragments destined to reinforce hidden seams. The organization is astonishing. Modern workshops might use labeled plastic bins. Here, memory performs most of the filing. The tailor lifts one oddly shaped scrap toward the light. It looks almost useless until he quietly trims it into a perfectly shaped reinforcement for the inside of a cuff. Suddenly, it has a purpose. You smile. Apparently, medieval tailors possessed a remarkable talent for seeing tomorrow inside yesterday. Outside, the familiar sounds of the town drift gently through the doorway. A baker calls out that fresh loaves are ready. A horse snorts impatiently. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith strikes glowing iron with slow, measured blows. Even the pigeons have resumed their endless conversations. They remain wonderfully committed to discussing absolutely everything. The master now reaches for another basket. This one contains garments brought in for alterations, a child's tunic, a woman's linen underdress, a worn cloak needing a new fastening. Nothing dramatic, nothing glamorous, simply ordinary clothing belonging to ordinary people. Yet every piece carries someone's daily life. One fascinating historical detail often overlooked is that children's clothing was frequently altered repeatedly as they grew. Instead of purchasing entirely new wardrobes every year, parents often lengthened sleeves, adjusted hems, or reused fabric from older garments belonging to siblings. Growing children kept tailors pleasantly occupied, children themselves less predictably occupied. The apprentice unfolds the little tunic. The sleeves are noticeably short. Its owner has clearly grown faster than the garment expected. The tailor studies the remaining seam allowance. Enough cloth has been folded inside the hem to extend each sleeve by several inches. Excellent. No additional fabric required. The apprentice carefully removes the old stitches. Tiny thread by tiny thread. No rushing. The original cloth must remain undamaged. You realize something remarkable. Sometimes the best repair involves simply revealing what was hidden all along. The folded fabric is gently released. The sleeve immediately becomes longer. Then fresh stitches secure the new hem. Simple, elegant, resourceful, nothing wasted. Another lesser-known historical fact surprises many historians. Some medieval garments included generous seam allowances specifically because tailors anticipated future alterations. Well-made clothing was expected to adapt over time, especially within prosperous households where garments might eventually pass from one family member to another. Clothes rarely belonged to only one chapter of life. They often accompanied several. The tailor now examines a faded cloak brought by an elderly widow. Its wool has thinned around the shoulders where years of weather have taken their quiet toll. Replacing the entire garment would cost more than she can comfortably afford. So instead, the master chooses reinforcement. A carefully shaped lining is stitched inside the shoulders, strengthening the weakened area without changing the cloak's familiar appearance. From the outside, almost nothing changes. Inside, everything becomes stronger. You find yourself thinking once again how often true craftsmanship remains invisible. The strongest work rarely demands attention. Outside, a group of travelers passes the workshop carrying heavy packs. Their cloaks display patches collected from countless journeys. Different colors, different fabrics, different years. Each repair quietly records another mile walked, another winter survived, another story lived. The apprentice watches them disappear down the street. Perhaps one day he will travel too. Many apprentices eventually became journeymen, working in different towns before opening workshops of their own. For now, though, this little shop remains his entire world. Another fascinating historical fact is that medieval cloth was sometimes turned completely inside out once the outer surface became excessively worn. Since both sides of tightly woven wool could remain serviceable, careful reconstruction occasionally gave garments several additional years of useful life. Imagine your favorite coat receiving an entirely new outside, without actually becoming a different coat. Remarkably practical. Rather clever. The afternoon grows pleasantly warm. Sunlight filters through the doorway, illuminating floating dust that drifts lazily above the workbench. The familiar scent of beeswax, wool, and fresh bread fills the room once again. You have grown surprisingly fond of that comforting mixture. It smells like honest work. The master pauses briefly to sharpen one of his smaller knives using a smooth whetstone. Not because it has become completely dull, because keeping tools sharp prevents future problems. Maintenance receives attention before failure. Another lesson quietly stitched into the day. The apprentice oils the hinges of the heavy iron shears. The blades open and close with satisfying smoothness. Even tools deserve care, perhaps especially tools that care for others. A customer arrives carrying nothing more than a handful of loose buttons collected from several worn garments. Could they be reused? The tailor smiles. Certainly. The apprentice immediately begins sorting them according to size and material. Bone, wood, metal, every fastening still capable of another lifetime. Nothing leaves the workshop if usefulness remains. Historians are still debating whether medieval households repaired clothing primarily out of economic necessity or because cultural attitudes genuinely valued preservation over replacement. The evidence suggests that both motivations worked hand in hand, creating a society where repairing possessions was simply an ordinary part of everyday life. The afternoon slowly slips toward evening. The child's sleeves have been lengthened. The widow's cloak has quietly regained its strength. The little basket of saved buttons has found new purpose. Not a single useful piece of cloth has been wasted. As the tailor folds another finished repair with the same gentle care he gives his finest commissions, you begin to understand that this humble workshop is doing far more than making clothes. It is extending lives, not human lives perhaps, but the long, patient lives of garments that continue warming shoulders, protecting travelers, comforting families, and carrying memories from one generation gently into the next. Haber, Part 13. The evening light lingers a little longer today, stretching golden bands across the workshop floor before slowly retreating toward the doorway. The repaired garments have been collected, the merchant's coat is steadily nearing completion, and for a brief moment the little tailor's shop feels wonderfully peaceful. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just the quiet satisfaction of work, honestly done. The apprentice finishes winding the last length of linen thread onto its wooden spool before placing it carefully inside the storage chest. Every tool returns home before nightfall. Every habit has its place. You begin to understand that routine is not the enemy of craftsmanship. Routine is what protects it. Outside, however, the peaceful rhythm suddenly changes. A church bell rings. Not the familiar pattern announcing prayers or market hours. This one is faster, sharper, urgent. People in the street pause. Several merchants step out from beneath their awnings. The tailor immediately walks to the doorway. He listens, then quietly closes the shutters halfway. Not in panic, simply with experience. A well-known historical fact is that church bells in medieval towns served many purposes beyond marking time. Distinct ringing patterns warned of fires, approaching danger, important civic announcements, or other emergencies requiring the attention of the community. In a world without newspapers, the bells became everyone's loudspeaker. Fortunately, they never needed charging. Soon the reason becomes clear: smoke. Not from the baker's ovens, not from evening fireplaces. A darker column rises from several streets away. Somewhere, a building has caught fire. The apprentice instinctively reaches for two wooden buckets standing beside the back door. No discussion is necessary. Everyone knows what to do. In tightly packed medieval towns, fire represented one of the greatest everyday dangers. Timber-framed houses stood close together. Roofs often contained thatch or wooden shingles, and countless homes relied upon open flames for cooking, heating, and lighting. One careless spark could threaten an entire neighborhood. The tailor joins several neighbors hurrying toward the smoke. You follow. People form long lines between the nearest well and the burning building. Buckets pass steadily from hand to hand. No one asks whose house is burning first. Helping comes before curiosity. The flames, thankfully, remain confined to a storage shed behind a cooper's workshop. Smoke fills the evening air. Water splashes. Voices remain remarkably calm considering the circumstances. Within an hour, the danger has largely passed. The building has suffered damage. Nearby homes have not. The entire street exhales. You quietly notice something. The tailor never complains about losing valuable working time. Some responsibilities outweigh business. Community comes first. One fascinating historical detail often overlooked is that many medieval towns gradually introduced regulations intended to reduce fire risks. Some communities restricted certain industrial activities within crowded neighborhoods, while others required householders to keep buckets, ladders, or basic firefighting equipment readily available. Preparation mattered, even if success was never guaranteed. Back inside the workshop, everything appears thankfully untouched. The apprentice immediately checks the storage chest containing folded cloth. Dry. Safe. The master quietly smiles. Relief needs very few words. As darkness settles outside, another visitor arrives, this time carrying troubling news. A merchant caravan expected from the north has been delayed. Heavy rains have washed away part of a bridge several days' journey from town. Several wagons remain stranded, including shipments of fine wool. The tailor nods thoughtfully. No frustration, only calculation. The workshop already possesses enough material for current orders. Future commissions, however, may require patience. You cannot help smiling. Even 8 centuries ago, supply chains still enjoyed surprising people. Some traditions truly refuse to disappear. The apprentice updates their mental inventory alongside the master. Enough dark wool, limited linen, very little fine blue cloth remaining. Every bolt suddenly feels even more valuable. Nothing will be wasted. Not 1 inch. Another widely accepted historical fact is that seasonal weather frequently disrupted medieval trade. Flooded rivers, snow-covered mountain passes, muddy roads, and damaged bridges could delay goods for weeks, sometimes even months, affecting prices throughout entire regions. Nature kept its own schedule. Merchants simply adapted. The following morning arrives cool and overcast. The workshop feels slightly darker than usual. Clouds soften the daylight filtering through the doorway. The tailor lights an extra oil lamp despite the expense. Fine stitching cannot wait for perfect weather. The apprentice sits beside the window repairing several needles that have developed tiny bends after months of use. You did not realize needles themselves could sometimes be straightened. Apparently, almost everything deserves a second chance. The master continues working steadily on the merchant's coat. His pace never changes. Whether sunlight floods the room or clouds cover the sky, consistency matters more than conditions. Outside, conversation throughout the marketplace has shifted. People discuss the delayed caravan, expected cloth prices, upcoming harvests, the recent fire. News travels remarkably fast when everyone walks everywhere. One curious historical fact surprises many historians. Medieval craftsmen often depended heavily upon personal relationships with traveling merchants. Trust established over many years frequently mattered just as much as written agreements, especially when expensive materials crossed long distances. Reputation traveled alongside every wagon, sometimes faster. The apprentice quietly asks whether the workshop should accept fewer new commissions until additional cloth arrives. The master thinks for a moment, then gently shakes his head. Instead, they will focus more heavily on repairs and alterations while conserving precious materials. Adaptation rather than panic, another timeless lesson. You remember the baskets of saved scraps, the carefully sorted buttons, the repaired sleeves. Everything suddenly makes even more sense. Nothing in this workshop exists by accident. Every habit prepares for difficult seasons. Outside, light rain begins falling softly upon the rooftops. Not enough to interrupt business, just enough to fill the air with the comforting scent of wet timber and damp earth. Customers arrive wearing heavier cloaks. Water drips from broad hoods onto the workshop floor. The apprentice quietly wipes the puddles away between visitors. No complaint, simply another small task woven naturally into the day. Historians are still debating whether the greatest challenge facing medieval tailors was mastering technical skill or successfully managing the unpredictable realities of weather, trade, material shortages, and changing customer needs. Surviving records suggest that the finest craftsmen excelled not only with needle and thread, but also with patience, flexibility, and remarkably careful planning. The rain continues tapping gently against the shutters. The merchant's elegant coat receives another row of nearly invisible stitches. The baskets of cloth remain carefully organized. The oil lamp burns steadily beside the window. And as another ordinary day quietly unfolds despite fires, delayed caravans, uncertain weather, and all the little surprises history likes to scatter along the road, you realize that perhaps true craftsmanship has never been about working only when conditions are perfect. It has always been about continuing calmly, carefully, and faithfully, even when the world outside the workshop insists on becoming just a little more complicated than yesterday. Number Part 14. The rain that arrived yesterday has finally moved on. This morning, the streets glisten beneath a pale golden sunrise, and every puddle reflects crooked timber houses as though the town has quietly doubled in size overnight. The air feels cleaner now, carrying the scent of damp earth, fresh cut wood, and the faint sweetness of bread already baking somewhere beyond the market square. Inside the little workshop, everything is exactly where you left it. The iron shears, the block of beeswax, the carefully wound linen thread, the familiar workbench polished smooth by decades of patient hands. Some places change very little. Perhaps that is exactly why they become comforting. The apprentice is no longer quite the awkward boy you first met. Over these many peaceful days, you have watched his movements become steadier, his stitches straighter, his confidence quieter. He still asks questions, just fewer of them. More often now, he already knows the answer before asking. The master notices too. He says nothing. He simply slides another piece of cloth across the table. That, apparently, is praise. A widely accepted historical fact is that many apprentices spent years gradually earning greater responsibility. At first, they swept floors, carried water, and organized tools. Later, they learned cutting, fitting, repairs, and eventually the delicate finishing work that distinguished an ordinary tailor from a remarkable one. Responsibility arrived one task at a time, not all at once. The apprentice picks up the heavy shears. You pause instinctively. This is different. Until now, the master has always made the first cut. Today, he simply watches. The young man smooths the wool exactly as he has seen his teacher do hundreds of times. He studies the grain, checks the chalk lines, takes one slow breath, then closes the blades. Snip. The sound feels strangely important. Not because the cut itself is extraordinary, but because it marks the quiet passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. The master nods once. That is all. The apprentice smiles for only a moment before returning to work. There is still far too much sewing to become distracted by pride. Outside, the marketplace grows busier. A woman carrying baskets of apples waves cheerfully toward the workshop. The tailor returns the greeting without looking up from his stitching. Regular customers, regular neighbors, regular mornings. Over years, these ordinary moments quietly become an entire life. One fascinating historical detail often overlooked is that many successful masters eventually trained multiple apprentices during their careers. Some of those students later established workshops of their own, spreading techniques, traditions, and family methods across neighboring towns and even distant cities. Ideas traveled with people, sometimes much farther than cloth itself. The apprentice now demonstrates a neat row of stitches along the inside of a cuff. The master inspects them carefully. One stitch sits slightly uneven. Only one. He gently points to it. The apprentice immediately removes 3 stitches, then 4, then carefully sews them again. No embarrassment. No frustration. Only improvement. Perfection, you realize, is rarely demanded. Care is. You begin thinking back to the very first morning in this workshop. The boy sweeping loose threads from the floor, the nervous way he carried folded fabric, the careful silence while watching every movement of the master. He seemed so young then. Now he moves around the room almost instinctively. He knows exactly where every tool belongs, which basket contains heavier wool, which needles suit thick cloth, how much beeswax the thread requires. Knowledge has settled into his hands, not merely his memory. Outside, 2 traveling merchants stop briefly to admire garments displayed near the doorway. The master allows the apprentice to greet them alone. Another lesson. Customers must trust him someday. He measures one merchant with calm confidence, not perfectly, but competently. The master quietly continues sewing without interrupting. Teaching sometimes means allowing small imperfections. Another well-established historical fact is that after completing an apprenticeship, many craftsmen became journeymen, working under several different masters before eventually earning the right to establish workshops of their own. These years of travel exposed them to new techniques, regional fashions, and unfamiliar customers. Learning never truly ended. It simply changed addresses. The merchants leave after placing a modest order. The apprentice carefully records the details on a wax tablet before smoothing an older section flat for future notes. You smile. Even paperwork gets recycled here. The master finally sets aside his needle. He reaches beneath the workbench and removes a beautifully worn pair of iron shears. Not the everyday pair, an older one. The handles shine from countless years of use. He places them gently into the apprentice's hands. No speech follows, no ceremony, just a quiet gift. The apprentice looks almost overwhelmed. You suspect these shears once belonged to the master's own teacher, perhaps even earlier. No one says. Some histories survive without words. One curious historical fact surprises many historians. Tools occasionally pass from one craftsman to another across generations, becoming treasured possessions not because of their material value alone, but because they represented trust, experience, and professional identity. A good pair of shears could outlive several owners. Much like a well-loved story. Outside, autumn begins quietly announcing itself. The breeze carries a slight chill. Customers increasingly ask about heavier cloaks and warmer sleeves. Winter is coming, not dramatically, simply inevitably. The workshop adjusts without complaint. Wool moves closer to the front shelves. Linen retreats slightly toward the back. The rhythm changes with the seasons just as naturally as the sunlight changes across the floor. You notice that nothing inside this little shop feels hurried anymore. Perhaps it never did. You were simply learning to notice its pace. The apprentice laughs softly after accidentally dropping a spool of thread. It rolls beneath the bench. The master chuckles too. For the first time since your journey began, you hear him laugh openly. A surprisingly warm sound. Apparently, even master tailors lose arguments with runaway thread. Some challenges truly unite humanity. The afternoon slips quietly toward evening. A grandmother arrives to collect a repaired cloak. A young father orders a sturdy winter tunic for his growing son. A messenger requests stronger stitching on his travel satchel before another long journey. Life continues, steady, unremarkable, beautiful. Historians are still debating whether the greatest legacy of medieval guild craftsmen lay in the garments they produced or in the generations of skilled workers they patiently trained. The surviving evidence suggests that while cloth eventually wore away, carefully taught knowledge often endured for centuries, stitched from one pair of hands into the next. The apprentice carefully hangs the gifted shears beside the workbench, not hidden away, not displayed proudly, simply placed where they will be needed tomorrow, because tomorrow there will be more cloth, more customers, more lessons, and one more ordinary day inside the little tailor's shop, where the quiet inheritance of patience, skill, and kindness continues passing forward with every careful stitch. Part 15. Morning arrives almost unnoticed. The workshop has become so familiar now that you no longer wake to the sound of church bells or the rumble of carts with any surprise. Instead, the little tailor's shop greets you like an old friend whose routines have become wonderfully predictable. The shutters open, fresh air slips inside. The workbench catches the first gentle rays of sunlight. The beeswax waits beside the neatly wound linen thread. The iron shears rest exactly where they have rested every evening for years. Nothing feels hurried. Nothing needs to prove itself. You realize something quietly remarkable. When you first stepped into this workshop, you saw only cloth, needles, and wooden benches. Now you see an entire way of life. The apprentice, though perhaps he should hardly be called an apprentice anymore, arrives carrying fresh bread beneath one arm. The master smiles. Again, only slightly. That tiny smile somehow says everything. Outside, the town is already alive. A baker arranges warm loaves on wooden shelves. A cooper rolls newly finished barrels into the street. A blacksmith's hammer rings with the steady confidence of someone who has repeated the same movement thousands of times. A shepherd guides a small flock through the market before the crowds become too thick. The tailor's shop is only one thread in this great fabric of medieval life. Yet without each thread, the fabric would slowly begin to unravel. A well-established historical fact is that the overwhelming majority of people in the Middle Ages lived lives that history books rarely describe in detail. While kings signed treaties and armies marched across kingdoms, ordinary craftsmen, farmers, merchants, bakers, and weavers quietly sustained the daily life of entire communities. History often remembers extraordinary moments. Civilization depends upon ordinary ones. The first customer of the morning arrives carrying a small bundle. Inside rests a child's wool cloak. Its owner has finally outgrown it. The tailor gently unfolds the garment. The cloth remains strong. The seams remain sound. Only the size has become too small. The master and his former apprentice exchange a glance. Neither speaks. The answer is already obvious. The cloak will become something new. The hem will be opened. The remaining cloth carefully measured. Some sections reused, others strengthened. Nothing wasted. You remember every basket of saved scraps, every button sorted by hand, every carefully folded patch. Suddenly, the entire journey comes together. Nothing in this workshop has ever been accidental. Every habit has prepared for moments exactly like this. One fascinating historical detail is that medieval households often transformed older garments into entirely different objects once they could no longer serve their original purpose. Worn cloaks became blankets. Good linen found new life as household cloths. Small pieces reinforced children's clothing. Even badly worn fabric sometimes became stuffing for cushions or protective wrappings for valuable tools. A garment rarely enjoyed only one lifetime. Sometimes it enjoyed several. The apprentice now cuts carefully into the little cloak. You notice how naturally he handles the shears. Weeks ago, you would have watched nervously. Today, you simply trust him. The master watches too, not because he expects mistakes, because teaching never really ends. The morning drifts peacefully onward. Customers come, customers leave. Coins gently clink into a wooden box. Measurements are taken, repairs promised, new commissions accepted. The rhythm continues exactly as it has for generations. Outside, seasons quietly announce themselves. Spring mud, summer dust, autumn leaves, winter frost. Each one changes the clothing people need. The workshop changes with them. Heavy wool moves forward during cold months. Lighter linen returns as warmer weather approaches. Fashion matters. Comfort matters more. Another lesser-known historical fact surprises many historians. Even after a master tailor retired or died, his workshop often continued operating under former apprentices or family members. Customers returned because they trusted the craftsmanship, not simply the individual. The shop itself became part of the community's memory. You imagine years passing, then decades. Perhaps the young apprentice eventually stands where the master stands now. Another nervous child sweeps loose threads from the floor. Another pair of careful hands learns how to wax linen thread. Another first sleeve, another first collar, another first successful fitting. The cycle quietly continues. Outside, children race through the street laughing. One trips, another helps him stand. They disappear around the corner. Somewhere nearby, someone begins singing while carrying baskets of apples toward the market. A dog stretches lazily beneath a wagon. The pigeons, incredibly, are still holding what must surely be the longest conversation in medieval history. Some things truly never change. The master finishes the final stitch on the merchant's elegant traveling coat. He lifts it carefully. The wool catches the afternoon sunlight. The seams lie perfectly flat. The collar settles naturally. The buttons sit evenly. Nothing demands attention. Everything simply works. He brushes away one invisible thread. Satisfied. No celebration, no announcement. Just another well-made garment ready to begin its own journey. Historians are still debating whether the greatest medieval tailors saw themselves primarily as artists, skilled craftsmen, or practical tradesmen. Perhaps the answer depended on the individual. Yet surviving garments suggest that the finest among them quietly blended all three, creating clothing that balanced beauty, durability, and usefulness with extraordinary care. The merchant arrives shortly before sunset. He slips on the finished coat. The fit is effortless. He lifts his arms, turns, sits, stands again, perfect. His smile is far larger than the tailor's. He thanks both master and apprentice warmly before disappearing into the evening streets. The workshop grows quiet, one last time. The apprentice sweeps the floor, the master oils the shears, needles return to their wooden box. The remaining cloth is folded neatly upon the shelves. The shutters close slowly against the cooling evening air. The church bells ring softly across the town. Smoke rises gently from chimneys. The marketplace empties. Day slips almost unnoticed into night. And as you stand in the little workshop one final time, you realize that history is not built only by emperors, castles, or famous battles. It is also built by patient people sitting beside open windows, guiding humble needles through simple cloth while the world quietly carries on outside. Their names may never appear in great chronicles. Their faces may never be painted into royal portraits. But every warm cloak worn through winter, every wedding tunic stitched with care, every child's sleeve carefully lengthened, every traveler's coat faithfully repaired, carries a small piece of their quiet devotion. Their work outlasted countless conversations. Sometimes it outlasted generations. Sometimes it became family heirlooms. Sometimes it simply kept someone warm during an ordinary evening. And perhaps that was always enough. The light outside has almost completely faded now. The little workshop rests in peaceful silence. The workbench, so busy throughout the day, stands empty once more. The familiar scent of wool, beeswax, polished wood, and cooling bread lingers softly in the still air. You can almost hear the faint scrape of yesterday's needle, the gentle whisper of cloth unfolding, the quiet laughter of an apprentice finally becoming a master. The patient rhythm never truly ends. It simply waits for another sunrise. As your thoughts begin to drift more slowly now, allow the busy streets to grow quieter. Let the market voices fade into the distance. Watch the last warm glow disappear from the workshop window. The shears have been carefully put away. The thread has been wound. The shutters are closed. The fire has settled into glowing embers. Outside, the stars slowly appear above the sleeping town. Inside, everything is exactly where it belongs. There is nothing more to finish tonight. Nothing left to repair. Nothing demanding your attention. Only the comforting knowledge that somewhere, in a quiet little medieval workshop, tomorrow's work is already waiting patiently. For now, you may simply rest. Breathe gently. Let the sounds become softer. Let the streets disappear into the night. Let the centuries drift quietly past like the slow movement of thread through cloth. And may your own evening be just as peaceful, steady, and quietly comforting as the little tailor's shop that has welcomed you these many gentle hours. Open quote, open quote, open quote, end of script. Sweet dreams, close quote, close quote, close quote.